Listen, Western nations. 3 minutes ago, I signed an executive order cutting all African gas exports to Western nations effective immediately. You supported bombing Nigeria, killing 47 civilians, including 19 children. You stayed silent while missiles destroyed African villages. Now you freeze. Libya stops all European exports. You bomb us. We freeze you. Winter is coming. See what I am doing to you. Let me tell you exactly what happened. The December 25th, 2025 bombing of Nigeria changed everything between Africa and Europe forever. Europe depends on African gas for survival. 23% of European gas consumption comes from Africa. You cannot replace it. Russia cut you off in 2022. America cannot supply enough. Qatar prioritizes Asia. Norway is maxed out. African gas is the difference between Europeans staying warm and Europeans freezing in their homes this winter. You took our gas for granted. You assumed we would always supply you regardless of how you treated us. You were wrong. We control the valves. We control the pipelines. We control the LNG terminals. We decide who freezes and who stays warm. You chose to support bombing our children. We choose to cut your gas. Simple cause and effect. Algeria cuts gas to Spain and Italy effective January 2026, 7 days from today. The Maghreb-Europe gas pipeline closes. The Medgas pipeline shuts down. 20 billion cubic meters annually that kept Spanish homes warm and Spanish factories running stops flowing. Spain's gas supply drops by 11% immediately. Spanish government has no plan to replace it because replacement does not exist at necessary volumes. Spanish gas storage holds approximately 3 months supply at normal consumption rates, but winter consumption exceeds normal rates and storage is already depleting. By 2026, Spanish storage is empty if Algerian supply remains cut. Spanish homes go cold. Spanish industries shut down because gas-fired power plants cannot generate electricity without fuel. Spanish economy enters recession as businesses close and unemployment spikes. Spanish government faces political crisis as population demands action, but no action can restore supply that Algeria controls. Spain imports LNG to partially offset pipeline losses, but global LNG market is tight and prices are prohibitively expensive. Spanish households cannot afford gas bills that triple or quadruple. Spanish government subsidizes prices to prevent riots, but subsidies cost tens of billions of euros that Spain does not have, forcing austerity in other areas or unsustainable borrowing. Spain suffers all this because Spain stayed silent when Nigerian children died. Italy suffers worse than Spain because Italian dependence on African gas is greater and alternatives are fewer. Italy imports approximately 70% of gas consumption, with North African supplies accounting for nearly 30% of total imports. Algeria supplies Italy through Transmed pipeline running from Algeria through Tunisia under Mediterranean to Sicily, with capacity of 33 billion cubic meters annually, making it one of Europe's largest gas pipelines. Libya supplies Italy through Greenstream pipeline running directly from Libyan fields to Sicily, with capacity of 11 billion cubic meters annually. Egypt supplies Italy through LNG shipments. Combined, North African gas represents 45 billion cubic meters annually, critical to Italian energy security. Italy attempted to reduce Russian dependence after 2022 by increasing North African imports, positioning Italy as European gateway for African gas. Italian Prime Minister traveled to Algeria, Libya, and Egypt to negotiate expanded supply agreements. Italian energy company Eni invested billions in North African gas infrastructure. Italy's strategy assumed North African suppliers would remain stable and willing partners. That assumption is destroyed on January 2026, when African supplies cut off simultaneously. Algeria closes Transmed pipeline, Libya closes Greenstream pipeline, Egypt cancels LNG contracts, Italy loses 45 billion cubic meters annually, approximately 30% of total consumption. Italian gas storage depletes within weeks. Italian industries shut down, including steel mills, chemical plants, glass factories, ceramics production that made Italy industrial power. Italian electricity grid faces blackouts because gas-fired generation is largest source of Italian electricity. Italian homes go cold as heating systems fail. Italian government declares energy emergency and implements rationing, but rationing cannot create supply that does not exist. Italian economy collapses into depression. Italian political system destabilizes as government falls and extremist parties surge. Italy suffers all this because Italy stayed silent when Nigerian children died. Italy chose American alliance over African lives. That choice costs Italian population everything. France freezes because French gas supply depends on African LNG and pipeline imports transiting Spain from Algeria. France produces almost no gas domestically after depletion of Lac Field. French gas consumption is approximately 40 billion cubic meters annually, nearly all imported. France diversified suppliers after Russian cutoff, increasing LNG imports from United States, Qatar, Nigeria, Algeria, and other producers. French LNG import terminals at Montoire, Fosse, and Dunkirk receive shipments continuously. African LNG represents approximately 18% of French imports, critical volumes that French system cannot function without. France also imports gas through pipelines from Spain, which originates in Algeria before transiting Spanish territory. Cut Algerian supply to Spain and French imports through Spain stop. Cut African LNG and French terminals sit empty. France loses approximately 25% of gas supply when African cutoff takes effect. French gas storage depletes rapidly under winter demand. French nuclear power plants, which generate 70% of French electricity, require gas for backup systems and grid balancing. French heating systems in millions of homes depend on gas. French industries, including chemical, pharmaceutical, and food processing, require gas. All this stops when African gas stops. French government implements emergency rationing, prioritizing hospitals and critical infrastructure, but rationing means millions of French households lose heating. French population protests in streets demanding government restore gas supply, but government cannot force African nations to supply gas they choose to cut. French president calls African leaders begging for supply restoration. African leaders ask one question: did you condemn the bombing of Nigerian children? French president has no answer. France stays cold. Germany freezes despite being Europe's largest economy and most powerful nation because German gas dependence is extreme and alternatives are exhausted. Germany consumed approximately 90 billion cubic meters of gas annually before 2022, supplied primarily by Russia through Nord Stream and other pipelines. German industry, especially chemicals, steel, and manufacturing, built around cheap, reliable Russian gas. German heating systems overwhelmingly use gas. German electricity generation depended significantly on gas plants. Russian supply cut after Ukraine invasion devastated German economy, forcing industrial shutdowns, government subsidies exceeding hundreds of billions of euros, and emergency LNG imports at premium prices. Germany survived by reducing consumption, subsidizing costs, and importing every available LNG cargo globally. Germany built 2 new LNG import terminals in record time to receive shipments. German gas supply in 2025-2026 depends on Norwegian pipeline gas, American LNG, Qatari LNG, and African LNG from Nigeria, Algeria, Egypt, and others. African LNG represents approximately 12% of German imports, smaller percentage than southern European nations, but critical volumes that Germany cannot replace. When African LNG stops, Germany scrambles to find replacement cargoes. None exist. Global LNG market is tight. Asian buyers pay premium prices, outbidding European buyers. American export capacity is fully utilized. Qatari cargoes are committed to long-term contracts. German gas supply drops 12% immediately. German industry, already suffering from years of high energy costs after Russian cutoff, cannot absorb another supply shock. German chemical industry shuts down. BASF, Bayer, and other chemical giants close plants permanently because operating without reliable gas supply is impossible. German steel production stops. German manufacturing, the core of German economic power, contracts severely. German economy enters recession that becomes depression as unemployment spikes, tax revenues collapse, and government debt explodes from emergency support programs. German political system fractures as population demands solutions that do not exist. German government blames Africa for energy cutoff. African response is simple: you stayed silent when our children died. Now you understand what silence costs. Britain freezes because British gas supply depends heavily on Nigerian LNG, and British gas storage is inadequate to buffer supply shocks. Britain produced significant gas from North Sea fields historically, but production has declined to approximately 40 billion cubic meters annually, while consumption remains approximately 80 billion cubic meters, requiring 40 billion cubic meters of imports. Britain imports gas through pipelines from Norway and Belgium and through LNG terminals at Isle of Grain, Milford Haven, and others. Nigerian LNG is Britain's largest single LNG supplier, representing approximately 15% of British gas imports. Britain chose Nigerian LNG over other suppliers because Nigerian gas is high quality. Nigerian LNG Limited has strong commercial reputation, and historical ties between Britain and Nigeria facilitated long-term contracts. British dependence on Nigerian supply was a strategic decision based on assumption that Nigeria would remain stable supplier regardless of political circumstances. That assumption is destroyed January 2026 when Nigerian LNG shipments to Britain stop. British gas supply drops 15% immediately. British gas storage holds only 2 weeks of consumption at winter demand rates, smallest storage capacity among major European economies, because Britain relied historically on flexible Norwegian pipeline supply and diverse LNG imports rather than building expensive storage facilities. 2 weeks of storage is insufficient to manage Nigerian cutoff. British households lose heating within weeks as storage depletes and supply shortages cascade through system. The British population suffers through the coldest winter in decades without adequate heating. The British media blames Nigeria for the humanitarian crisis. Nigerian response is broadcast globally. Britain stayed silent when American missiles killed Nigerian children on Christmas Day. Britain chose alliance over justice. Now British people understand what injustice feels like. We regret British civilian suffering, but we do not apologize. African lives matter as much as British lives. When you treat African lives as worthless, do not expect us to treat your comfort as priority. The economic consequences of African gas cutoff extend far beyond immediate heating and electricity shortages. European industries depending on gas as feedstock or energy source shut down permanently because investing in restart after temporary shutdown is uneconomical when supply reliability is uncertain. The European chemical industry produces fertilizers, plastics, pharmaceuticals, and thousands of other products using gas as feedstock and energy source. Shutting down chemical plants destroys catalysts, damages equipment, and breaks supply chains that took decades to build. Restarting requires massive investment and months of preparation. Many companies choose not to restart, but instead relocate production to regions with stable energy supply, including the United States, Middle East, and Asia. European chemical industry, already struggling with high energy costs and regulatory burdens, collapses permanently. The European steel industry similarly cannot operate without reliable gas supply. Steel production requires gas for heating, reducing iron ore, and various chemical processes. European steel industry contracts permanently, destroying hundreds of thousands of jobs and eliminating critical industrial capability. European manufacturing, depending on chemicals and steel as inputs, suffers cascading failures as supply chains break. The European automotive industry cannot build cars without steel and plastics. The European construction industry cannot build without steel and cement production requiring gas. The European food industry cannot operate without fertilizers produced from gas and without gas for food processing and refrigeration. The entire European economy is an integrated system where gas cutoff in one sector cascades through multiple sectors, causing total economic collapse. European governments respond to African gas cutoff with emergency measures that prove inadequate. Governments implement rationing, prioritizing critical infrastructure, including hospitals, emergency services, and essential industries. Rationing means ordinary households and non-essential businesses receive reduced gas supply or no supply at all. Governments subsidize gas prices to prevent prices from rising to market clearing levels that would cause immediate economic collapse and political unrest. Subsidies cost hundreds of billions of euros collectively across the European Union. Governments lack fiscal capacity to sustain subsidies for extended periods, forcing a choice between cutting subsidies and allowing prices to spike or continuing subsidies and accepting unsustainable budget deficits. Governments attempt to import replacement LNG from alternative suppliers. The global LNG market cannot supply required volumes. Asian buyers, especially China, Japan, and South Korea, compete for the same cargoes and pay premium prices that European buyers cannot match without massive subsidies. American LNG export capacity is maxed out and cannot increase significantly in the short term because building new liquefaction facilities requires years. Qatari LNG is committed to long-term contracts and cannot increase exports substantially. No replacement sources exist at necessary volumes. European governments pressure African nations to restore supply. African response is unified. Condemn the bombing of Nigerian children publicly. Demand accountability from the United States. Support ICC investigation of December 25, 2025 massacre. Until you do these things, gas remains cut. European governments refuse because refusing African demands is politically easier domestically than confronting the United States. European populations suffer while European leaders maintain alliance with America over African lives. European political systems destabilize under pressure of energy crisis and economic collapse. Governments fall across Europe as populations lose confidence in leaders unable to provide basic necessities, including heating and electricity. Right-wing populist parties surge in elections by promising to restore energy security through deals with Russia or military action to seize African gas fields. Left-wing parties surge by promising to abandon the American alliance and align with the global South. Centrist establishment parties that governed Europe for decades collapse because voters blame them for energy dependence and foreign policy failures that caused the crisis. The European Union faces an existential crisis as member states pursue conflicting national strategies. Some nations attempt bilateral deals with African suppliers, breaking EU unity. Other nations call for collective EU response, including sanctions on African nations or military intervention to restore gas supply. EU institutions cannot coordinate effective response because consensus is impossible when member states face different levels of crisis and have conflicting interests. The European integration project, built over 70 years, threatens to unravel because the energy crisis reveals fundamental weakness. Europe is not genuinely sovereign but dependent on external suppliers for critical resources. That dependence is vulnerability that suppliers can exploit when political circumstances change. Europe assumed African suppliers would always prioritize commercial relationships over political grievances. Europe learned that assumption was arrogant and wrong. The global implications of African gas cutoff to Europe extend far beyond European borders. Global LNG prices spike to historic levels as European buyers compete desperately for any available cargoes. Asian buyers face higher prices even though African cutoff does not directly affect Asian supply because the global market is integrated. Higher energy prices drive inflation globally. Central banks respond by raising interest rates, slowing economic growth globally. Developing nations suffering debt crises face an impossible choice between paying for energy imports at premium prices or defaulting on debts. The global economy enters a recession triggered by the European energy crisis. International institutions including IMF and World Bank face demands for emergency support from European nations, reversing the traditional pattern where European nations and the United States provided funding and developing nations received conditional loans. Global South nations observe the European crisis with grim satisfaction, noting that Europe is experiencing an economic crisis similar to what structural adjustment programs imposed on developing nations for decades. Russia benefits enormously from the European crisis by offering to restore gas supply at premium prices in exchange for lifting sanctions and recognizing Russian control of Ukrainian territories. China benefits by expanding influence in Europe, offering energy investments and infrastructure financing in exchange for political concessions, including recognition of the Chinese model as an alternative to Western liberal democracy and acceptance of Chinese technology, including Huawei 5G, despite American pressure. The United States faces an impossible choice between supporting European allies by pressuring Africa to restore supply, which means confronting African nations potentially backed by Russia and China, or abandoning Europe to the crisis, which destroys NATO alliance and American leadership of the West. Every option is bad for American interests because the fundamental problem is that America bombed Nigerian civilians and Europe supported it through silence, creating justification for African response that Global South supports and American power cannot simply override. Winter deepens across Europe while African gas remains cut. Temperatures drop to record lows. European homes go cold. European hospitals struggle to maintain heating. European schools close because buildings cannot be heated. European elderly die from hypothermia in homes without heat. European children suffer in freezing apartments. European populations realize that comfort they took for granted depended on African resources they assumed would always flow regardless of how Africa was treated. That assumption is destroyed by reality of cold homes and dark streets. European media covers crisis extensively, blaming Africa for humanitarian catastrophe. African media responds by broadcasting images of Nigerian children killed by American missiles on Christmas Day, asking whether European children suffering from cold compares to African children suffering from being blown apart by explosives. Global South media amplifies African message that Europe is experiencing consequence of supporting war crimes. Western narrative that Africa is responsible for European suffering is rejected by majority of world population who see European crisis as deserved consequence of colonial arrogance. Europe cannot win information war because facts are clear. America bombed civilians. Europe stayed silent. Africa responded by cutting gas. Europe suffers. Cause and effect is undeniable. This is the new reality of African power. For centuries, Europe extracted African resources through colonialism, slavery, exploitation, and unequal trade. European powers carved Africa into artificial territories at Berlin Conference in 1884, without a single African present, drawing borders that served European administrative convenience and resource extraction rather than African ethnic, cultural, or political realities. European colonizers enslaved millions of Africans, shipping them across Atlantic to build wealth in Americas while depopulating Africa and destroying African societies. European companies extracted African gold, diamonds, copper, cobalt, uranium, oil, and gas for European benefit while Africans remained impoverished. European governments imposed unequal trade relationships that forced African nations to export raw materials at low prices while importing European manufactured goods at high prices, ensuring that wealth flowed from Africa to Europe generation after generation. European banks financed African corruption and stored stolen African wealth in European financial centers, enabling kleptocracy while lecturing Africa about governance. European militaries intervened repeatedly in African affairs to protect European interests, overthrow African leaders who challenged European dominance, and install compliant regimes that served European objectives. Throughout this history, Europe assumed African weakness was permanent, assumed that African nations would never develop capacity to resist European domination, assumed that African populations would accept subordination indefinitely because alternatives did not exist. Europe assumed African resources would always be available on European terms, that African gas would flow to European markets whenever Europe demanded, regardless of how Europe treated Africa, that commercial relationships would continue regardless of political grievances because African nations needed European markets more than Europe needed African resources. Europe assumed African grievances could be ignored without consequence, that Africans would complain but ultimately comply, that African anger was impotent rage without power to enforce demands or impose costs on European nations that dismissed African concerns. All these assumptions, built over centuries of domination and reinforced through generations of European superiority complex, are proven catastrophically false by African gas cutoff that brings Europe to its knees within weeks of implementation. The assumptions were always arrogant and racist, reflecting European belief that Africans were inherently inferior and incapable of collective action or strategic thinking. The assumptions were always wrong, but European power prevented Africans from demonstrating that they were wrong. Now African power demonstrates it conclusively. Europe is freezing because Africa chose to cut gas. Europe cannot force Africa to restore supply. Europe cannot militarily seize African gas fields because African nations are defended by Rescue Alliance and backed by Russia and China. Europe cannot economically coerce Africa because Africa has alternative markets and partners. Europe's centuries of assumptions collapse in winter cold that penetrates European homes and exposes European vulnerability. Africa controls resources Europe needs to survive as modern industrial civilization. This is not exaggeration or propaganda. This is geological and economic reality. Europe has almost no domestic fossil fuel resources remaining after centuries of extraction-depleted coal mines and North Sea oil and gas fields. European renewable energy, including wind and solar, provides approximately 40% of electricity generation but cannot yet provide reliable baseload power or replace gas for heating and industrial processes. European nuclear power in France and Belgium provides additional electricity but requires gas for grid balancing and backup systems. European civilization in its current form depends on imported energy, primarily natural gas for heating residential and commercial buildings, generating electricity, providing feedstock for chemical industry, fueling industrial processes, and supporting transportation. Cut that gas and European civilization stops functioning within weeks. Africa supplies 23% of European gas consumption through pipelines from Algeria and LNG from Nigeria, Algeria, Egypt, Libya, and Mozambique. The December 25, 2025 bombing of Nigeria changed everything between Africa and Europe forever. Europe depends on African gas for survival. 23% of European gas consumption comes from Africa. You cannot replace it. Russia cut you off in 2022. America cannot supply enough. Qatar prioritizes Asia. Norway is maxed out. African gas is the difference between Europeans staying warm and Europeans freezing in their homes this winter. You took our gas for granted. You assumed we would always supply you regardless of how you treated us. You were wrong. We control the valves. We control the pipelines. We control the LNG terminals. We decide who freezes and who stays warm. You chose to support bombing our children. We choose to cut your gas. Simple cause and effect. That 23% is difference between European system functioning marginally and European system collapsing completely. European gas storage provides buffer of several months at normal consumption rates, but storage is already partially depleted by January 2026 after winter consumption, and storage cannot be refilled while supply is cut. European alternative suppliers cannot replace African volumes because global LNG market is tight with limited spare capacity and because pipeline alternatives do not exist at necessary scale. Norway supplies Europe through pipelines at maximum capacity already. Russia cut supplies after Ukraine invasion and European sanctions. United States exports LNG to Europe, but American capacity is fully utilized and cannot increase substantially in short term. Qatar exports LNG globally but prioritizes Asian contracts and cannot redirect sufficient volumes to Europe. No other suppliers exist at scale necessary to replace African gas. Europe's energy security strategy since Russian cutoff in 2022 depended on diversification, including increased African supply. That strategy assumed African suppliers were reliable and apolitical. That assumption is destroyed. Africa controls supply Europe cannot replace. That control is power Europe cannot overcome. That power restructures relationship between Africa and Europe permanently. Africa has alternative partners including Russia and China who buy African gas at fair prices without political conditions or colonial arrogance. Russia needs gas markets after European sanctions close traditional export routes. Russian state gas company Gazprom negotiates with African producers to purchase African gas for re-export to Asia or for domestic Russian consumption, providing African producers with reliable buyer if European markets remain closed. Russia offers technology transfer, infrastructure investment, and political support through UN Security Council veto protecting African sovereignty against Western intervention. China needs gas to fuel industrial economy and transition from coal to cleaner energy sources. Chinese state energy companies sign long-term contracts with African producers guaranteeing purchase of specified volumes at prices indexed to oil or other benchmarks, providing revenue stability. Chinese contracts include financing for gas infrastructure, including pipelines, liquefaction facilities, and export terminals that African nations need to monetize reserves. China offers Belt and Road Initiative financing for development projects across Africa, creating comprehensive partnership that goes beyond simple commodity trade. Both Russia and China respect African sovereignty in ways Europe never has. Neither Russia nor China lectures Africa about governance or human rights. Neither Russia nor China imposes political conditions on energy contracts. Neither Russia nor China supports Western military intervention in Africa. African nations prefer partners who treat them as equals rather than former colonies requiring supervision. European arrogance and American aggression push Africa toward Russia and China. European gas cutoff accelerates that strategic realignment. African gas that previously flowed to Europe now flows to Asia or stays in Africa for domestic consumption and intra-African trade. European markets that seemed indispensable 1 month ago become irrelevant as African producers redirect supply to partners who respect African sovereignty and pay fair prices without demanding political subordination. Africa has continental solidarity through African Union and Rescue Alliance that coordinates response to European aggression and prevents European divide-and-conquer tactics. Historically, European powers exploited divisions among African nations to maintain dominance, offering selective deals to individual nations that broke African unity and weakened collective bargaining power. European strategy was to isolate and pressure individual African nations, making examples of nations that resisted European demands while rewarding nations that complied, creating incentive structure that discouraged continental solidarity. That strategy fails when African nations coordinate through continental institutions. African Union coordinates gas cutoff across all African producers simultaneously, ensuring that Europe cannot replace Algerian supply with Nigerian supply or Libyan supply with Egyptian supply. All African gas to Europe stops together. African Union also coordinates diplomatic messaging, ensuring that African nations present unified position demanding European condemnation of December 25, 2025 bombing and European support for ICC investigation of American war crimes. Unity makes African position strong because Europe cannot divide African nations or negotiate separate deals that undermine collective position. Rescue Alliance coordinates military defense, ensuring that European nations cannot threaten military intervention to seize African gas infrastructure without facing collective African military response backed by Russia. European military intervention in Algeria would trigger Rescue Alliance response deploying forces from Nigeria, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Chad to defend Algeria. European military intervention in Nigeria would trigger response from remaining Rescue Alliance members plus broader African Union support. European militaries, already stretched thin by commitments in Eastern Europe and Middle East, cannot fight continental war in Africa against determined resistance. European threats are empty. European power is insufficient. African solidarity makes African position unassailable. Africa has moral authority because Africa is defending civilians killed by Western missiles while Europe defended the killers through silence. December 25, 2025. Bombing killed 47 Nigerian civilians, including 19 children. The victims were innocent people going about daily lives, shopping for Christmas goods, gathering with families, celebrating holiday. American missiles killed them without warning, without justification, without accountability. Nigeria demanded investigation and condemnation. Europe stayed silent. That silence was not neutral. Silence in face of atrocity is complicity. European governments that stayed silent effectively endorsed American bombing, signaling that African lives are worthless and American actions are acceptable regardless of civilian casualties. European silence communicated to Africans that Europe values American alliance more than African lives, that strategic relationships matter more than human rights, that power matters more than justice. African response to that silence is to cut gas supply, imposing economic cost on Europe for political decision to support American war crimes through silence. This response is justified under any moral framework. Europe cannot claim that cutting gas is aggression when Europe supported actual bombing that killed actual children. Europe cannot claim that African response is disproportionate when European silence enabled American violence. Europe cannot claim moral high ground when Europe abandoned morality by staying silent. Global South supports African position because populations across Asia, Latin America, Middle East, and Africa recognize that Western nations apply double standards, condemning violence by weak nations while ignoring or supporting violence by strong nations. International law and human rights are invoked selectively to serve Western interests rather than applied universally to protect all victims. African gas cutoff exposes that hypocrisy and demonstrates that victims of Western violence can impose costs on perpetrators and enablers. This is justice imperfect but real. This is accountability enforced by victims because international institutions controlled by Western powers refuse to enforce it. This is moral authority that comes from defending the dead against those who killed them and those who stayed silent while they died. The power balance has shifted permanently and irreversibly between Africa and Europe. For centuries, Europe was powerful and Africa was weak. European military technology, economic development, and political organization gave Europe overwhelming advantage that enabled colonization, exploitation, and continued domination even after formal decolonization. European power meant European interests prevailed when African and European interests conflicted. European demands were commands that African nations had to accept or face consequences, including economic sanctions, military intervention, or political isolation. European opinions about African governance mattered, while African opinions about European policy were ignored. That power imbalance defined relationship for generations and shaped African expectations about what was possible. Many Africans internalized inferiority, believing European wealth and power reflected European superiority rather than historical circumstances and exploitation. Many African leaders acted as European clients rather than sovereign rulers, prioritizing European approval over African interests because European power seemed permanent and resistance seemed futile. That era is over. Power balance has shifted because African nations control resources Europe needs while Europe controls nothing Africa cannot obtain elsewhere. Europe needs African gas more than Africa needs European markets. Europe needs African cooperation more than Africa needs European approval. Europe needs African resources more than Africa needs European investment that comes with political conditions and corruption that benefits European corporations and African elites while impoverishing African populations. Africa can survive and thrive without Europe by developing intra-African trade through Continental Free Trade Area, by partnering with Russia and China and other non-Western powers, by investing African resources in African development rather than exporting wealth to Europe. Europe cannot survive without Africa because European energy security depends on African gas. European industries depend on African raw materials including cobalt, lithium, copper, rare earths essential for green energy transition and digital economy. European agriculture depends on African phosphates for fertilizer, and European demographics depend on African immigration to fill labor shortages and support aging European populations. Dependence creates vulnerability. Europe is vulnerable to African decisions in ways Africa is not vulnerable to European decisions. That vulnerability is power imbalance favoring Africa. That power enables Africa to impose terms on relationship with Europe, to demand respect for African sovereignty, to require accountability for Western violence, and to cut supply when demands are not met. This is revolutionary change in international relations. This is decolonization realized economically after political decolonization proved insufficient. This is African agency asserted through control of resources and willingness to weaponize that control for political objectives. Europe needs Africa more than Africa needs Europe in every dimension of relationship. Economically, European imports from Africa, including energy, minerals, and agricultural products, are essential for European industrial civilization, while European exports to Africa, including manufactured goods, technology, and services, are desirable but not essential because Africa can obtain similar products from China, India, Turkey, and other producers, often at lower prices and with better financing terms. Demographically, Europe faces aging population and declining birth rates creating labor shortages across industries, while Africa has youngest population globally with median age under 20 and population projected to reach 2.5 billion by 2050. European economies need African workers, while African workers have options including staying in Africa as economies develop or migrating to Gulf states, Asia, or Americas, offering better treatment than Europe. Politically, Europe needs African support in international institutions, including UN General Assembly, where African nations represent 54 votes, more than quarter of total membership, enough to block resolutions or pass measures with support from Asia and Latin America. Africa does not need European political support because multipolar world provides alternatives and because African interests often conflict with European interests, making European opposition inevitable regardless of African deference. Strategically, Europe needs access to African territory for military bases, intelligence operations, and influence over African governments to counter Russian and Chinese expansion. Africa does not need European military presence and increasing increasingly demands withdrawal of European forces from Sahel, North Africa, and Horn of Africa. Every dimension of relationship favors Africa when analyzed honestly without colonial assumptions about European superiority. Europe depends on Africa for survival as modern civilization. Africa does not depend on Europe for development or security. That fundamental asymmetry restructures relationship with Africa as dominant partner and Europe as dependent partner, seeking African favor. European leaders resist accepting this new reality because accepting it requires abandoning centuries of supremacist ideology and acknowledging that power has shifted. European resistance is futile because reality does not change based on European preferences. Europe freezes whether European leaders accept new reality or not. Accepting reality enables negotiation that restores gas supply on African terms. Refusing reality means Europe freezes while leaders explain to freezing populations why ideology matters more than warmth. African gas can go to Asia, to Africa itself through expanded domestic consumption and intra-African trade, to partners who respect African sovereignty rather than to European markets that take African resources for granted. Asian gas demand is enormous and growing as Asian economies industrialize and populations urbanize. China alone consumes over 350 billion cubic meters annually. Japan, South Korea, India, Thailand, Pakistan, and other Asian nations import massive LNG volumes. Asian buyers compete for global supply, driving prices higher than European buyers can afford without unsustainable government subsidies. African producers can redirect LNG cargoes from European destinations to Asian destinations with minimal operational changes because LNG tankers are fungible and buyers are flexible. Spot LNG market enables rapid redirection of cargoes to highest bidder. Asian premium over European prices provides revenue windfall to African producers, offsetting any political pressure from cutting European supply. African domestic gas consumption is growing rapidly as African nations electrify economies, industrialize, and improve living standards. Nigeria uses approximately 55% of gas production domestically for power generation. Egypt uses gas for electricity and industry. Algeria increasingly prioritizes domestic consumption over exports. Expanding domestic consumption reduces dependence on export markets and ensures that African resources serve African development. Intra-African gas trade is developing through regional pipeline projects connecting producers and consumers within continent. West African gas pipeline connects Nigeria to Benin, Togo, and Ghana. Trans-Saharan gas pipeline project would connect Nigeria through Niger to Algeria and potentially to other Sahel nations. East African nations explore gas infrastructure connecting Tanzania, Mozambique, Kenya, and others. Intra-African trade keeps African wealth within Africa, supports African industrialization, and builds continental integration. African gas serving African needs is economically rational and politically desirable. European markets are not indispensable. European demand is not command. European expectations are not African obligations. Africa chooses where gas goes. That choice reflects African interests and African values. Europe that supports bombing African children loses access to African gas. Europe that respects African sovereignty and demands accountability for war crimes can negotiate restoration of supply. Choice is Europe's. Consequences are Europe's. Power is Africa's. European markets are not indispensable despite European assumptions otherwise. Europeans believed for centuries that African producers needed European markets because Europe was wealthy, stable, and paid reliably. Europeans believed African producers had no alternatives because European consumption was large and alternative buyers were limited. Europeans believed African dependence on export revenues meant African producers would always prioritize maintaining European market access over political considerations. All these beliefs were wrong. African producers have multiple markets including Asia, domestic consumption, and intra-African trade. African producers can reduce production if necessary rather than accepting European political demands as condition for market access. African producers are sovereign nations that prioritize political objectives including defending sovereignty and demanding accountability for violence against their citizens over maximizing short-term export revenues. European market is one option among several. European market is not indispensable. European assumptions reflect colonial mentality that assumes African subordination is natural and permanent. Reality contradicts assumptions. Africa demonstrates independence by cutting supply to Europe despite commercial cost. Africa demonstrates sovereignty by prioritizing political objectives over European market access. Africa demonstrates that European power is insufficient to compel African compliance. European leaders and public struggle to accept this reality because accepting it requires fundamental revision of worldview that places Europe at center and Africa at periphery. European centrality is myth. Multipolar world has multiple centers and Europe is declining while Africa is rising. European assumptions about indispensability are proven false by African actions that impose costs Europe cannot bear. European choice is to accept new reality and negotiate as equals, or to refuse reality and freeze while reality persists regardless of European acceptance. European demands are not commands despite European habit of issuing demands and expecting compliance. European governments demand that African nations restore gas supply immediately and unconditionally. African response is simple refusal. European threats of sanctions, trade restrictions, and political isolation are meaningless because Africa has alternative partners and because European sanctions hurt Europe more than Africa by further reducing trade and cooperation. European threats of military intervention are empty because European militaries lack capability to invade and occupy multiple African nations simultaneously while facing Russian and Chinese opposition and African resistance. European demands that Africa negotiate bilaterally with individual European nations rather than collectively through African Union are rejected because bilateral negotiations enable European divide and conquer tactics, while collective negotiations maintain African unity and bargaining power. European demands that Africa separate commercial gas contracts from political issues are rejected because commercial relationships exist within political context and cannot be separated when political issues involve war crimes and civilian deaths. European demands that Africa prove commitment to international law and contract sanctity are hypocritical because Europe violated international law by supporting American bombing without UN authorization and violated contract sanctity by imposing sanctions on Russia that broke European gas contracts. European double standards are transparent. European demands are not commands because Africa is sovereign and Europe lacks power to enforce demands. Europe can request. Africa can refuse. Europe can negotiate. Africa can set terms. Europe can accept terms or continue freezing. European choice. African power. This is new reality Europe must accept because alternatives do not exist. European power is not sufficient to force Africa to comply with European demands for gas supply restoration. European military power cannot seize African gas infrastructure because infrastructure is dispersed across multiple nations, because seizing infrastructure does not create technical capability to operate complex gas extraction and liquefaction facilities without cooperation of African workers and engineers, and because military occupation of African territory would face armed resistance from African forces backed by Russia and China, potentially escalating into great power conflict Europe cannot win. European economic power cannot coerce African compliance through sanctions because African nations have alternative trade partners and because European sanctions hurt European industries depending on African imports more than they hurt African exporters who can redirect supply. European political power cannot isolate Africa internationally because majority of world supports African position that bombing civilians deserves condemnation and accountability, because Russia and China veto any UN Security Council action against Africa, and because Global South solidarity is stronger than European influence. European soft power, including cultural influence, educational exchanges, and historical ties, cannot overcome African anger at European silence about murdered children. No dimension of European power is sufficient to force African compliance. Europe must negotiate as equal rather than dictate as superior. Europe must meet African terms including public condemnation of December 25, 2025 bombing, support for ICC investigation, and commitment to respect African sovereignty. Europe must abandon colonial mentality and accept multipolar world where European wishes are not African commands. European power was sufficient to dominate Africa for centuries. That era is over. European power now is insufficient to warm European homes without African gas. That insufficiency is European crisis and African opportunity. Europe learns hard lesson that power is relative and contextual. Europe was powerful when Europe had military and economic advantages. Africa was weak when Africa lacked organization and alternatives. Circumstances changed. African organization and Russian-Chinese partnerships neutralize European advantages. African control of resources creates European dependence. Power balance shifts. Europe becomes supplicant, Africa becomes arbiter. This is justice after centuries of reversed roles. This is the multipolar world that Western nations feared and resisted. Western dominance after 1945 and especially after 1991 depended on unipolar moment where United States and Europe controlled international institutions, dictated global rules, intervened militarily anywhere without serious opposition, and imposed economic conditions on developing nations through IMF and World Bank. Western nations resisted emergence of multipolar world where multiple power centers including China, Russia, India, and potentially unified Africa compete for influence and where global South nations assert sovereignty refusing Western dictates. Western resistance included NATO expansion threatening Russia, trade wars targeting China, sanctions against nations challenging Western interests, and military interventions preventing emergence of strong independent governments in resource-rich regions. Western resistance failed because underlying trends including Chinese economic rise, Russian military modernization, global South demographic and economic growth, and information technology enabling coordination among non-Western nations created structural conditions for multipolarity that Western actions could delay but not prevent. African gas cutoff accelerates multipolar transition by demonstrating that Western nations cannot secure essential resources without cooperation from suppliers who demand respect and accountability. Western nations can no longer simply take what they want through colonial extraction or unequal trade. Western nations must negotiate with suppliers who have alternatives and who prioritize political objectives over commercial relationships when forced to choose. This is fundamental change in international system, ending 5 centuries of Western domination and creating space for non-Western nations to shape global order according to their interests and values. Western nations mourn loss of dominance. Rest of world celebrates emergence of system where multiple perspectives and interests compete rather than single Western perspective being imposed universally. This is the end of European hegemony. European global dominance ended militarily in World War II when European powers destroyed each other and required American intervention to defeat Germany. European colonial empires ended politically in decolonization era from 1945 through 1970s when colonized peoples fought for and achieved independence, but European economic and ideological hegemony persisted through control of international financial institutions, through soft power including cultural influence and educational prestige, through claims of moral authority as defenders of human rights and democracy, and through economic relationships that kept former colonies dependent on European markets, technology, and investment. That residual hegemony is ending now through multiple trends including European demographic decline, European economic stagnation relative to Asia, European political fragmentation with rise of populist parties and weakening of EU integration, and European loss of moral authority through hypocrisy exemplified by Epstein's scandal and silence about bombing of African children. African gas cutoff is symptom and accelerant of European decline. Symptom because cutoff is possible only because Europe is weak enough that Africa can impose costs without facing overwhelming European retaliation. Accelerant because cutoff inflicts economic damage that further weakens European economies and political systems. European hegemony is over. European future is as middle power among many, important regionally but not dominant globally, dependent on others for resources and markets, forced to negotiate as equal rather than dictate as superior. Europe must adjust to diminish status or suffer decline through resistance to inevitable change. African gas cutoff forces that adjustment immediately through economic crisis that makes European weakness undeniable. Europeans who accepted decline gracefully could have negotiated managed transition, preserving some influence and maintaining cooperative relationships. Europeans who resisted decline through arrogance and silence about African deaths face chaotic collapse and African contempt. Choice was Europe's, consequences are Europe's, era is over regardless. This is African sovereignty asserted through control of resources and willingness to use that control for political objectives. Sovereignty is not merely legal status recognized by international institutions. Sovereignty is practical capability to control territory, resources, and population, and to defend those against external interference. African nations achieved legal sovereignty through decolonization, but lacked practical sovereignty because economic dependence, military weakness, and political fragmentation made African nations vulnerable to external pressure and unable to pursue independent policies. African sovereignty was incomplete and often illusory. African leaders made decisions based on preferences of former colonial powers, IMF, World Bank, and multinational corporations rather than based on African interests. That era of incomplete sovereignty is ending through multiple developments, including African control of resources through nationalization and more favorable contracts, African alternative partnerships with Russia and China reducing dependence on West, African continental integration through AU and regional bodies enabling collective action, and African willingness to prioritize sovereignty over commercial relationships when forced to choose. African gas cutoff demonstrates practical sovereignty. Africa controls gas. Africa decides who receives it. Africa demands political terms. Africa enforces those terms by cutting supply. External powers cannot override African decisions. This is sovereignty realized through power. This is decolonization completed decades after political independence. This is Africa determining its own future rather than accepting future designed by external powers. African sovereignty is not gift granted by international recognition. African sovereignty is power asserted through control and defended through capability and will. Europe that respects African sovereignty can negotiate partnership. Europe that dismisses African sovereignty freezes without gas. Reality enforces sovereignty that rhetoric alone cannot establish. This is justice for Nigerian children killed on Christmas Day while Europe stayed silent. 47 dead, 19 children. Their names are known, their faces are mourned, their deaths are avenged through African action imposing costs on those who killed them and those who stayed silent. This is not perfect justice. Perfect justice would be prosecution of American officials who authorized the bombing, conviction in international court, imprisonment for war crimes, compensation to families, and guarantee that such bombings never happen again. That perfect justice is unavailable because American power blocks ICC jurisdiction, because Western nations protect American officials from accountability, because international law is enforced selectively against weak nations but not against powerful ones. Imperfect justice is what victims can achieve when perfect justice is denied. Imperfect justice is African gas cutoff that punishes Europe for complicity in American crimes. Imperfect justice hurts innocent Europeans whose government stayed silent but who personally bear no responsibility for December 25th bombing. Imperfect justice is regrettable but necessary because powerful nations only respond to costs they cannot ignore. European silence would continue indefinitely if silence had no consequences. European governments would continue supporting American violence if support had no price. African gas cutoff imposes consequences and price. European populations freeze and demand their governments explain why American alliance is worth freezing. European governments face impossible choice between condemning American bombing to restore gas supply or maintaining American alliance while populations freeze. That choice is justice because complicity must have costs, because silence about murdered children must be punished, because those who enable violence must suffer consequences. African children died. European leaders stayed silent. European populations freeze. This is justice imperfect but real, achieved through African power exercised in defense of African lives. Nigerian children are avenged not through international courts that refuse to act, but through African solidarity that imposes costs on those who killed them and those who stayed silent. This is the only justice available when international system protects powerful and punishes weak. This is justice victims create when institutions deny it. You are freezing now. Your homes are cold because thermostats cannot heat homes without gas to fuel heating systems. Your children shiver under blankets because heating has been cut to ration insufficient supply. Your elderly die from hypothermia because their bodies cannot maintain temperature in cold apartments. Your hospitals struggle to operate because heating and backup power systems require gas. Your industries are dark and silent because gas-fired power plants cannot generate electricity without fuel. Your streets are cold because public buildings cannot be heated. Your economies are collapsing because industries cannot operate, workers cannot work, businesses cannot function without energy. You are experiencing what you inflicted on others for centuries. You are living with consequences you created through silence. This is what silence costs. You stayed silent when our children died. You offered no condemnation. You demanded no accountability. You continued business as usual with the nation that bombed us. You prioritized American alliance over African lives. You chose power over principle. That choice costs you everything now. Your comfort, your prosperity, your security, your future, all gone because you stayed silent when silence meant complicity in murder. We stay silent while you freeze. We offer no sympathy for your suffering because you offered none for ours when American missiles killed 47 Nigerian civilians, including 19 children on December 25, 2025. We express no regret for cutting gas supply because you expressed no regret for supporting those who killed our children through your calculated silence and continued alliance with their murderers. We maintain cold professional silence watching Europe freeze just as Europe maintained cold professional silence watching African children die in Maiduguri market while shopping for Christmas goods with their families. This is symmetry perfectly calibrated to mirror your actions. This is reciprocity operating according to principles you established through centuries of colonial domination where African suffering was ignored and African complaints were dismissed. This is you experiencing what you inflicted on colonized peoples, on enslaved Africans, on populations you exploited for resources while denying them basic humanity and dignity. Do you understand now what it feels like to be powerless while those stronger than you inflict suffering without accountability or remorse? Do you understand the helplessness of watching your children suffer from cold while those with power to end that suffering refuse to act unless you meet their demands? Do you understand what it means to beg for mercy from those who have none, to plead for compassion from those who offer only cold calculation of interests and power? Do you understand why African populations celebrate your suffering even though we know intellectually that ordinary Europeans freezing in their homes are innocent of their government's crimes and bear no personal responsibility for European silence about the December 25 bombing? African populations celebrate not because we are cruel or because we enjoy suffering, but because your suffering is justice, imperfect and incomplete, but justice nonetheless, because for the first time in centuries, Africans possess power to make Europeans suffer consequences for European complicity and violence against Africans. Your suffering validates that power. Your suffering proves that African agency is real and that African sovereignty can be enforced. Your suffering demonstrates that the colonial era when Europeans inflicted suffering on Africans without consequence is permanently over. This is why we celebrate even while regretting that innocent people suffer. This is why we maintain silence even while acknowledging that silence inflicts harm. This is cold logic of power relations that Europe taught us over centuries. You are learning lessons Africans learned over centuries of European domination. You are learning that power matters more than justice, that strong nations can inflict suffering on weak nations without facing accountability, that international law and moral principles are invoked selectively to serve power rather than applied universally to protect victims. You are learning that might makes right in international system where no authority exists capable of restraining powerful nations and where weak nations must accept whatever powerful nations impose. You are learning that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, as Thucydides observed 25 centuries ago in description of Athenian imperialism that applies equally to European colonialism and American hegemony. These are Europe's lessons taught to Africa through colonialism that extracted African resources while impoverishing African populations, through slavery that treated Africans as property rather than humans, through exploitation that structured global economy to transfer wealth from Africa to Europe, and through wars and interventions that destroyed African governments daring to challenge European interests. Now you learn your own lessons as weaker party in relationship where power imbalance favors Africa. Now you suffer what you taught us to accept as natural and inevitable. You taught us that suffering of weak is irrelevant to strong. You taught us that justice is whatever serves interests of powerful. You taught us that sovereignty of weak nations means nothing when powerful nations decide to intervene. You taught us that our children's lives matter less than your strategic interests. We learned those lessons thoroughly through centuries of painful experience. Now we teach those lessons back to you through gas cutoff that makes you suffer while we watch with same cold professional detachment you displayed watching our children die. This is education through experience, the most effective pedagogy because lessons learned through suffering are remembered permanently. This is karma operating across historical timescales where centuries of inflicting suffering return as decades of experiencing suffering. This is justice imperfect because your suffering is temporary and reversible while African suffering was permanent and generational, but justice nevertheless because accountability exists and consequences follow complicity even when international institutions refuse to enforce accountability. We offer you one path to restore gas supply. Only one path exists. The path is clear, straightforward, and publicly stated so that no confusion exists about requirements. The terms are non-negotiable because negotiations imply equality of bargaining positions and mutual compromise, but power imbalance means Africa sets terms and Europe accepts or refuses without modification. Africa will not negotiate terms downward. Africa will not accept partial compliance. Africa will not restore gas supply until all terms are met completely. This is our decision enforced by our control of gas valves and our willingness to accept commercial costs of cutting supply because political objectives including justice for murdered children and accountability for complicit silence matter more than short-term export revenues. Europe can accept our terms or continue freezing. No third option exists. No clever diplomatic solution avoids binary choice. No backroom deals or special relationships or historical ties change fundamental reality that we control supply and you need it and we will not provide it until you meet our demands. Condemn the December 25, 2025 bombing of Nigeria publicly and unambiguously. Public means through official government statements, parliamentary resolutions, European Union declarations, and media communications that reach European and international audiences. Unambiguous means stating clearly without diplomatic hedging or both sides rhetoric that American bombing of Nigerian civilians was wrong, violated international law, constituted war crime, and deserves condemnation. Issue statements through your governments with prime ministers, presidents, and foreign ministers speaking on record declaring that their governments condemn the bombing. Issue statements through your parliaments with majority votes passing resolutions that condemn the bombing and express solidarity with Nigerian victims. Issue statements through European Union institutions including European Commission, European Parliament, and European Council that speak for Europe collectively rather than only individual member states. Declare explicitly that American bombing of Nigerian civilians was war crime that violated international law prohibiting attacks on civilians, violated Nigerian sovereignty by conducting military operation without Nigerian government authorization, and violated UN Charter prohibiting use of force except in self-defense or with Security Council authorization. Name the crime, call it what it is: war crime, murder of civilians, violation of sovereignty. State it clearly, state it repeatedly, state it prominently so that your condemnation reaches global audiences and especially African audiences who need to see that Europe finally acknowledges that African lives matter and African deaths deserve condemnation equal to European deaths. Demand United States accountability through ICC investigation. Demanding accountability means more than symbolic gestures. Demanding accountability means supporting ICC prosecutors' investigation of December 25th bombing as war crime and crime against humanity. Support means providing evidence, including satellite data tracking missile launches and impacts, intelligence reports documenting American military operations, radar tracks showing missile trajectories, communications intercepts revealing operational planning, and witness statements from European military personnel observing American operations. Provide everything you have that supports prosecution. Pressure United States to cooperate with investigation rather than blocking it through threats, sanctions, or refusal to recognize ICC jurisdiction. Use your alliance relationship with United States to demand cooperation. Tell American government that European support for American foreign policy is contingent on American accountability for war crimes. Tell American government that transatlantic alliance cannot survive if America kills civilians and Europe stays silent. Tell American government that cooperating with ICC investigation is price of maintaining European alliance. Apply pressure through diplomatic channels, through media statements, through parliamentary actions, through economic leverage. Make clear that Europe demands accountability and will not accept American refusal. If United States blocks investigation, support alternative accountability mechanisms including universal jurisdiction prosecutions in European courts, UN Human Rights Council investigations, or special tribunals. Accountability must happen through some mechanism. Europe must demand it persistently and publicly.